Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rebecca Berg and I am the Stakeholder Engagement Associate at the Climate Registry. We're very excited to present our webinar today covering embracing transparency and accountability to achieve net zero without greenwashing or greenhushing. First, a few housekeeping notes. You're all on mute by default. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please type those into the GoToWebinar question box that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. Following the presentation, we will be sending out a PDF of the slide deck and a recording of the webinar to everyone who registered for the event. We'll also be talking about a couple different resources and reports during the presentation, and we will be including those in our follow-up email as well. So please look out for that in the following day or so. I'd like to start off by introducing our speakers today. I'm joined by the Climate Registry's Executive Director, Amy Holm, as well as our Policy Director, Dan Kreckelberg, and our Net Zero Policy Coordinator, Elsie Andreev. Throughout this webinar, we will be covering topics such as the state of net zero, what is greenwashing and greenhushing, how transparency and accountability can be valuable tools to combat these challenges, and some of the tools that TCR has developed to support organizations in their efforts to achieve net zero. Now I'd like to turn it over to Amy Holm, who will be giving a little bit of background on the Climate Registry and what we do.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. We're excited to get started, but like Rebecca said, before we dive into the topic of net zero, we wanted to provide you with a little background information on the Climate Registry if you're not familiar with our organization. So the Climate Registry, or TCR, was formed in 2007, and we work very hard to inspire, educate, and connect organizations to be strong, positive forces in building a sustainable future. We are a nonprofit organization that focuses on North American organizations, so we do work globally in our efforts to do more in the fight against climate change, specifically through supporting credible carbon reporting. So TCR creates and manages innovative tools for the measurement and reporting of GHG emissions and drives action ambition by recognizing and showcasing climate leadership through convenings, such as through our annual Climate Leadership Conference and Climate Leadership Awards. As part of our efforts, in January of this year, we launched the Net Zero Portal, a free-to-use platform designed by industry experts to support transparency for net zero commitments pathways. So for more information on this platform will be provided later in the presentation. But before we get to that, I would like to turn it over to Dan Kreckelberg, Director of Policy, who will discuss the state of net zero and the policy landscaping surrounding this topic. Dan?
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so I'm going to dive in here and talk a little bit about the state of net zero and what I mean about the state of net zero, where things are at right now with commitments for net zero emissions. So just to kind of go back a little bit, net zero interest and commitments have been building over the last few years in response to scientific research showing the need to sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to stay on a trajectory to 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. So after the publication from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their special report, since that time, a few years ago, there have been thousands of public and private organizations that have committed to net zero emissions or a related sort of target within their own operations or jurisdictions. And that can be a target typically no later than 2050. Sometimes the targets and commitments are much sooner than that as well. In 2023, so last month, a report was published called the Net Zero Stocktake, taking a look at net zero commitments globally, both public and private commitments around the world. And over 4,000 entities were reviewed to look at where they stood on their greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, and whether or not they included net zero as part of the target. The report found that 75% of national governments had set a net zero target of some kind, and 145 states and regions had set targets as well, 252 cities, and 929 publicly listed companies of those 4,000 entities that were reviewed. The research showed a trend from compared to 2020 that companies are continuing, there's an increase in companies continuing to set net zero emissions targets, though some of the largest companies in the world still do have a net zero target. For those that do have a target, there were findings that sometimes indicators of progress toward meeting that target were missing. And this looked at criteria from the UN's net zero Race to Zero campaign, specifically a starting line criteria, which evaluates several different metrics of net zero commitment. So only 3% of governments and 4% of companies were found to meet the Race to Zero campaign's current requirements, which were recently updated, which just, it shows a need for more robust net zero targets to be set. And that criteria that I mentioned is pretty stringent. It includes scopes 1, 2, and 3, requirements for immediate mitigation to happen, public reporting and advocacy for net zero through networks and supply chains as well, for companies specifically. So yeah, it's challenging criteria to meet. Some organizations are doing that, but certainly there's room for growth and improvement there. And those findings were consistent with a report that came out last year from the United Nations high-level expert group on net zero commitments. This high-level expert group was formed to look at the quality of net zero commitments and the need to improve. And the term greenwashing was used to look at whether some of the organizations setting net zero commitments were doing enough to follow up to meet those commitments, and also being fully transparent about the details of their target. So I'm going to talk about that report a little bit more. Next slide, please. In this Integrity Matters report, 10 recommendations were made in 5 principal areas. I won't get into all the recommendations, but I do want to point out a few here that are important. Now, this high-level expert group took a global perspective. It was composed of experts representing 16 countries. So not just looking at this through a US lens where we're located, but really getting representation from around the world to look at net zero and how it's playing out. So within this report, it was found that it was recommended that there be more transparency and accountability, and strongly emphasizing a few areas. That interim targets should be set every 5 years. Pledges should be on track to cut emissions in half by 2030 and entirely by 2050 or sooner. Pledges should disclose emissions data and describe progress on a yearly basis. And the information should be shared publicly in a format that's comparable to peers, and that pledges are rooted in actionable strategies going forward. So also within that, there was a recommendation for having a global central digital repository. And as we designed the Net Zero portal, we were already pretty far along in the development process, but looked into that and took that into consideration that this could potentially be a tool that met the recommendation and could be used for organizations around the world to be able to be transparent about the work that they're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to talk about a few of the frameworks, guidance, and standards that exist. So the UN made recommendations, that report I mentioned, but there are an awful lot of guidance and reporting frameworks that already exist that entities are using in order to set their targets. So I have a few of them listed here on this slide. Most of these were developed for voluntary reporting. Some are targeted to specific sectors. There is also a movement beyond voluntary, but some mandates as well for net zero that are starting to be seen in regulations, either at the subnational level, targeted specifically to agencies for procurements, for example, or internal operations. And those can point to agencies to develop specific guidelines or regulations on how to hit net zero, or they can point to a third-party standard or guidance on how to do that. So as we work to develop the portal, Net Zero portal, we looked at a lot of these existing programs and provided the ability for anyone reporting to the portal to be able to describe which programs or guidance that they're using to inform their net zero target. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to talk for a minute about the power and need for transparent data. It's very important for transparency in data to be able to get the information out there in a way that both identifies the net zero target and also progress that is happening on an interim basis, and also be able to show a balance between reductions and offsets. Sometimes there is concern about over-reliance on offsets for meeting net zero emissions targets, but being transparent provides an opportunity to show how that balance can shift over time and maybe focus more on reductions. And also an opportunity to show how the work is being integrated into strategic plans and internal for external reporting, and also allocating resources within organizations to make good on meeting that net zero target. So we see transparency as a real opportunity to show how that work is transpiring. And also, you know, what's happening right now is that a lot of organizations that are sharing that were early adopters of net zero targets, they may be getting called out for saying that, oh, this is, you know, not the ideal way to set a target, or not enough progress is being made. And, you know, a reaction to that in some instances has been to actually hold back some information and transparency and say, well, you know, we'll continue to do the work, but just not share if it, you know, it will be critiqued. And, you know, what our position is that transparency is actually a good thing, and you should actually double down on doing that transparency and be even more transparent if getting critiqued, because it provides an opportunity to get feedback, to adjust if necessary, and also tell the story about any barriers for why the net zero target is having challenges being met, and also the progress that is being made and the plan going forward on how to meet that target. So we think that transparency is very important part of the process, and reporting GHG emissions, making sure they're verified, and any offsets being used are validated. This is also important tools to really increase the confidence that that an organization is approaching this in the right way and being clear about where they want to go. So yeah, Elsie is going to talk a little bit more about greenwashing and greenhushing, how those terms are being defined, and how being transparent and reporting can help with some of the critiques that are coming about net zero targets. So Elsie, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Dan. My name is Elsie Andreev. I'm the Net Zero Policy Coordinator at the Climate Registry. Throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll dive into both greenwashing and greenhushing and how they relate to transparent net zero pledges and strategies. To start off, I'll give you a background on both greenhushing and greenwashing. So greenhushing is a fairly new concept. It describes when organizations aren't disclosing the positive climate action they are taking. And this can be due to fear of being called out for falling short, there not being a central global repository of data collection, which can lead to confusion, and the perception that not enough people are out there who care to know. And there are consequences to this. It can lead to less ambitious climate pledges being set, missed opportunities for collaboration, and the appearance of there not being a large amount of urgency on this issue. And greenhushing can actually be considered a type of greenwashing because despite taking climate action, not having a public benchmark prevents the full scope of accountability that's possible for an organization and required for us to reach net zero emissions globally. And greenwashing is a term that many of us might be familiar with already, but it refers to when organizations are making loftier claims of climate action than can be backed up with data. So this greenwashing thrives in environments that don't prioritize accountability and urgent climate action. And it's bad not only for the planet, but for the organization's bottom line. Organizations can lose investor and shareholders' trust, and avoiding climate action leaves organizations unprepared for the financial risks from the energy transition. Widespread lack of ambition on net zero also will leave the entire world less resilient to the physical risks of climate disruption. So genuine leaders struggle to stand out among dishonest claims, which can lead to cynicism, confusion, and less urgent climate action. And organizations can only be accused of greenwashing if they make bold claims and have no proof for how they'll meet those claims. According to the UN recommendations that Dan had just described before, having a net zero or carbon neutrality goal founded in integrity requires having a strategy for accomplishing it with interim goals set for every 5 years until your ultimate goal. And having a rigorous strategy requires diving deep into your supply chain, inventorying your emissions, and identifying high emitting sectors. So if you're already inventorying your emissions, you're already part of the way to being able to develop a legitimate and actionable net zero strategy. And we understand that greenwashing is a serious accusation with real consequences, but we want to demonstrate how you can avoid it by being transparent about what you're doing and how we at the Climate Registry can support that. Next slide, please. So we want to show that not just making pledges, but showing the pathways and emissions data publicly allows for comparison, accountability, knowledge sharing and collaboration, leadership, and raising ambition cumulatively. Leadership and accountability helps combat greenwashing and greenhushing because by demonstrating transparency, climate leaders are able to set themselves apart from greenwashers. And innovators and early adopters of ambitious and transparent climate strategies, they create a roadmap for others to learn from best practices. They create opportunities to share solutions to overcome the challenges and barriers we're all facing. And they help make rigorous climate action part of the status quo. So when we crowd organizations into a room where they're surrounded by climate leaders leading the change, then it'll help them get onto the same path and want to be doing the same thing. Also, civil society deserves to know what's going on in their world. It's their air and their water. So they're a powerful force for accountability, and we should embrace them because they are going to reward organizations that are doing really great work. And being transparent increases ambition because, as I said before, greenhushing can lead to less ambitious pledges, less momentum towards net zero, and just the appearance of not enough urgency to meet our global net zero goals. So we are trying to frame scrutiny as a good thing. We shouldn't shy away from it because it will likely happen. But if we can reframe it as an opportunity that forces us to raise the bar and constantly strive to move forward, it becomes less daunting if it does happen. By mobilizing a movement of transparency and climate disclosure, that works when we can see accountability and scrutiny as something that forces us to do better, and momentum requires urgency. Motivation comes from the urgency to act, and organizations that are motivated will go where they feel there is momentum behind a cause. Knowledge sharing and comparison. Greenhushing makes it really hard to find opportunities to work together. And scope 3, inventorying emissions in scope 3 is a really big and complex challenge that everyone is going through right now. Right now, there is the standard on what should be included in scope 3 is standards that are on what should be included in scope 3 are ambiguous, and how these categories are applied globally is inconsistent. So this ability of being able to compare and learn from other strategies on emissions reduction, especially scope 3, and can help everyone accomplish this extra difficult and daunting task of meeting a net zero goal. Comparison is necessary, and having like a centralized place where organizations can compare data will allow for knowledge sharing and accountability. So as much as you can provide, you should do it and update when you learn more. And knowledge sharing and collaboration also go hand in hand. Knowledge sharing and just sharing your process and collaborating with one another is how we can get to net zero. We have to understand that we're all still learning and adapting. But if we're transparent about where we're running into roadblocks, any barriers, and how to overcome them, it's going to make these complex tasks much less scary and daunting. And also having an understanding of the solutions required to overcome these barriers will allow regulators to create solutions that work. And the United Nations says that this can create what they call an ambition loop, which is a positive feedback loop of where government policies and private sector leadership reinforce one another to create bold climate action. And basically, we're running out of time to tiptoe around this. We have to learn from and embrace scrutiny. Anything that you're doing that's rooted in credible data and commitment to sustainability is better than nothing. The climate work we do is difficult and time consuming, so we should all try to find ways to embrace the work when it's being done right and to promote more work to be done right. Next slide, please. In order to meet the needs of transparent and credible data, we at the Climate Registry developed the Net Zero portal for the purpose of housing net zero targets and their pathways in a centralized location. We developed this tool to help move the convo along in terms, the conversation along in terms of collaboration and pledges, and also to give organizations that don't have a pathway, a place to start, and a roadmap for how they might accomplish that. And for organizations that do have a pathway, they can continue to build on it, learn more strategies from others, and set themselves apart as leaders by providing these roadmaps. And the Net Zero portal looks to be a big tent that is bringing all of this information together and providing resources so that like people can go into other organizations and look into what they're doing with their data and compare and hold each other accountable and learn from each other. We are working with many other organizations to share information, and anyone who creates a profile can detail any other initiatives or alignment within their profiles. And some of these other net zero organizations might be doing different types of net zero approaches, like focusing on different sectors or geographic areas. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about the portal on the next slide, please. So NZP is a free public platform, and it's available to any company, organization, or subnational government around the world. We have a resource library that organizations, while they're making profiles, can contribute to and tag resources. The goal is to make the data comparable, which will help ramp up ambition and accountability. And our advanced search feature makes the comparison much easier, because you're able to find organizations with similar structures, similar sizes, and learn from them. Others can also use this data to learn best practices, because if you're showing what you're doing to achieve net zero, you're going to encourage others and inspire others to follow in your footsteps and learn from you. And this gives you a seat at the table with climate leaders who want to know what works and what doesn't work. And like I said, this creates ambition. People go where there's momentum, but by being exactly clear about what steps you're taking, you'll be able to reduce or eliminate claims of greenwashing and greenhushing. And a benefit of the portal is it allows you to tell your own story and not just show your own data. We allow organizations to detail their carbon neutrality pledges, not just net zero, and you can go in and update whenever you have new progress or new information. It gives the ability for organizations to detail their interim targets, which are set every 5 years up until their goal and linked to their public plans. And being net zero as opposed to carbon neutral requires using carbon removal offsets, not just regular offsets. So the portal allows organizations to detail their offset strategies, which is really interesting to a lot of people who are starting to deal with carbon removals, which are difficult and costly. So it's really important to get that data out there. The portal also gives organizations the option to detail any social impacts that they take into account, any environmental justice or equity goals, or projects that impact vulnerable communities. And it's a start, but putting something out there that shows you're working on a goal will help to reduce greenwashing claims. And something that we love about the portal is that it's an iterative process. You can show that you're making progress towards your goal in a format that you might not see in your 5-year plan or your impact report. And also, you can use it as a tool to maintain records and track goals internally, because we require organizations to update their information and their scope data on a yearly basis. And by showing interim progress, we'll, like I said, help combat claims of the greenwashing. And right now, emerging technologies and innovation are constantly advancing, and what is seen as ambitious today isn't going to be considered so in 5 years. So this ability to update pledges and show the public that you're constantly striving to push your net zero date will help you avoid these accusations, because you'll constantly be showing that you have a plan and that you're updating your progress. So you can do all of these things. You can be transparent, show your data, and you might still get accused of greenwashing regardless. But greenhushing is not the answer to that, because it'll still lead to less ambitious pledges and therefore less opportunity to stay below 1.5 degree rise in Celsius temperatures. And this missed collaboration, this missed opportunity for collaboration is detrimental to organizations that do want to start but need support or a roadmap. It creates an appearance of a lack of urgency, which decreases motivation amongst all, and can create cynicism and prevent us from staying below a 1.5 degree rise in Celsius. Also, we hope that the portal will someday be used to connect organizations together and help them learn from each other and reach out to organizations that might be stuck or confused or who need to know other strategies. So we hope that once there's a lot of information in there, we'll be able to do that. I'm going to talk about a few profiles that are in the portal, and I just want to mention as an aside that we only recently decided to allow carbon neutrality pledges in addition to net zero pledges, and are currently updating the website to have language that reflects that. So just to give a high-level overview, we'll start with SoCal Gas. It's the nation's largest natural gas distribution utility, and they're the largest natural gas distribution utility in the nation to include scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions in their target. They are committed to achieving net zero by 2045 in their operations and delivery of energy. And I really highly recommend checking out their pathway because you can read about their commitment to recognizing social impacts of and building environmental justice and equity goals into their net zero strategies and projects. And you can also learn about their efforts to tackle scope 3 emissions. The California Department of Water Resources is next. It's a state agency, part of the California Natural Resources Agency. They work to protect and restore natural and human environments while managing California's current and future water needs. They are committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2035. They've surpassed their goal of reducing carbon CO2 emissions at least 60% below 1990 levels by 2030, which is really awesome. You can go to their profile and learn about their strategies, any operational adjustments they've made, and pathway contingencies that they've detailed. Next slide, please. Our next two organizations are companies of very different sizes. To start, WSP is one of the world's leading professional services firms, and they employ more than 55,000 professionals. They are taking urgent action to strengthen resilience to climate disruption by committing to the energy transition, not just for themselves, but for all of their clients. They have a net zero target of 2040 from a 2018 base year, and they have an interim target of reducing absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions 60% by 2030 from the same base year. And this surpasses UN recommendations of reducing emissions 50% by 2030. Their high integrity commitment details their strategies for selecting high quality carbon removals once they've reduced emissions as much as possible. And you can head over to their profile to learn more about their alignment with other net zero initiatives, and also to find out what strategies they found most successful and challenging. And next we have Yoko Co. It's much smaller. It's a web developer that works exclusively with organizations that prioritize purpose over profit. So any organizations that's doing positive work. It was founded by Chris Yoko, the founder of Carbon Off, and they've already surpassed their carbon neutrality goal of 2020. They were able to eliminate scope 1 and 2 emissions. They reduced scope 3 as much as possible, and they offset the remainder. You can head over to their profile at netzeroportal.org to learn about any general pillars of their strategies they took as a tech-driven organization, and learn about some of the other organizations we have currently in the portal. Next slide, please. So just in summary, emissions are increasing. We are currently experiencing the hottest July this planet has ever seen, probably in the last 120,000 years. Antarctic sea ice isn't recovering in the winter, and the United Nations said that it is possible for us to limit temperatures, but only if we mobilize wide-scale climate action. So I just want to emphasize that it is possible, but only if we take concerted and drastic efforts now. And like I said earlier, having inventories of your emissions and looking through your value chain and setting targets has many benefits. And you're already on the way to having a greenwashing proof strategy. And We hope that we've been able to show that greenwashing undermines efforts. It increases risks to organizations and to the planet as a whole. It also decreases the urgency to act and reduces collective ambition, and we lose key opportunities for collaboration. And to summarize the benefits that come from being transparent about the net zero process, being transparent embraces scrutiny as a positive force of change to hasten momentum. We have to constantly strive to do better, and we need to stop seeing it as a bad thing, but see it as a force for good. Being transparent also facilitates the confidence organizations need to make and set pledges that create solutions to common barriers, and this requires widespread knowledge sharing and understanding that this is a collective process we're all going through, and we should share notes. And also, being transparent is going to foster the urgency and the motivation that we need to meet the demands of our climate, and it's inevitably going to lead to innovation. And by preparing and by having really rigorous climate goals, organizations will be able to prepare for climate risks and prepare for the financial risks of the energy transition, and ultimately be better off. So even if you do get accused of greenwashing and greenhushing, if you can show that you're still doing the work and you are doing the work, you're still going to be positioned better off than a greenwasher that's not doing the work. And I think that's really important to understand. So it's also difficult work, and greenwashing it makes it hard for organizations to shine. But if we're transparent if we're transparent about credible climate action, and if we embrace and support and highlight these organizations that are taking bold action, greenwashing won't be as daunting of an issue, because we will see it as we'll be able to platform leaders and make it really clear what kind of work is needed, and it'll make it a lot harder for organizations to greenwash, and that should be a goal for all of us collectively. And being transparent also helps us to raise ambition collectively. By constantly raising the bar and striving to do better and embracing scrutiny, it allows us to raise the bar in basically the only way for us to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we can talk for hours about the ways that we can help you combat greenwashing and greenhushing, but just know that this is a problem that affects us all. If we don't prepare for this transition and for climate risks, we are all going to face much worse physical risks from climate disruption. And there's really great work being done out there, and we need to be able to find collaborative solutions to barriers that we're all experiencing. So like I said, we should share notes and support each other through this process. So with that, we're gonna move into our concluding remarks and Q&A. Next slide, please. And before we move into our Q&A, I wanted to let you guys know that you can, if you're interested in the Net Zero portal and you wanna learn more about how we can help you track your goals, you can schedule a meeting with us. We are setting up a scheduler, which we'll send out in the email that will follow this webinar. And if you need help inventorying your emissions, you can become a member of the Climate Registry, and specifically the Carbon Footprint Registry that we have. And until September 1st, we're actually right now offering a discount on membership for new members. So you have about another month left to take advantage of this. Also, keep your eyes peeled for a blog that's coming soon that's going to delve deeper into these topics that we touched on today briefly. And with that, we can move into our Q&A.
Thank you, Elsie and Dan and Amy. I am going to look through some of the questions that we received. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to still put them in the questions box, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I just wanted to address one just kind of logistics question first. We will be sharing the slide deck with participants after the presentation today, as well as the recording and any links to resources that we talked about during the presentation. So look out for that email likely coming within the next day. First question that we got is that as a carbon management consultant, I've experienced several clients holding back on disclosure and commitments in fear of the proposed SEC ruling. This could be seen as greenhushing. What is TCR's opinion on the implications of the proposed SEC ruling to a company's disclosure and commitments, specifically where they have fallen short on commitments or revised disclosures and commitments?
Well, I can take that one. Be happy to. So yeah, SEC rulemaking is something we've been closely following. I'm hearing, in the fall, there's an expectation that there will be a final rulemaking. Still not clear what that will look like yet. The draft has been out for a while. We've heard a lot of things about what or will not be included in that. But I think holding back at this point, it's the wrong time to hold back, because the whole intent of that rule is to get information out for publicly traded companies, for their investors. And so getting in the practice of voluntarily disclosing that information is a good practice to get into, to be ready for when that rule does go into effect, that there will be the ability to provide the type of data that they're looking for. And that also, it creates requirements for disclosure, but there's even the potential to go above and beyond what's being required. If you look at scope 3, for example, there's materiality assessment and looking at which scope 3 categories apply. But there's the regulation and what that will require. But it doesn't stop there. There's even the ability to provide more detail on scope 3, and then even get to work on the mitigation part of it, which I think is probably the most important part. You have the data and you're tracking the data and being transparent and disclosing, but then actually moving forward and focusing on those greenhouse gas emissions reductions and tracking that year to year, I think is really important. So yeah, it's a good time for, as a consultant, to advise clients that they should get in the practice of being Anyone else from the team have anything to add to that?
I don't.
I think you summed it up well. Oh, Amy, we're having trouble hearing you.
To be an early reporter and to understand how to display your information, track it, display it, share it, is a really good habits to get into now.
Right. Thank you. All right, another question that we got is, let's see. I guess this is just a clarification. Does the portal include climate transition plans?
It allows organizations to link to their climate transition plans. And if you go into the portal right now, you'll be able to see organizations linking to them and detailing them as well.
All right, another question is, how do we count the embodied carbon so that the true life cycle impacts are recorded?
Dan, take that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we've seen this in some strategies from organizations that are looking at embodied carbon, and really going into the life cycle of an end product or activity and looking at all the emissions that are associated with that. It can be included as part of a plan. Typically for emissions inventories, it's looking at the scope 1, 2, 3 as laid out by our general reporting protocol or the greenhouse gas protocol. But there's certainly further analysis that could be done to get into those life cycle considerations and look at the full embodied carbon that is going into an analysis of greenhouse gas emissions. So as I said in the last comment, there's always further analysis that can be done. So even if, you don't maybe necessarily need to immediately do embodied carbon as part of a net zero plan, it is something that as the plan develops or as more detailed information becomes available, can be incorporated into a net zero plan. So I think it's an important point, and yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Great, thanks. So I'm sure this is a question that a lot of people have, but as committing to net zero pledges can be very expensive for many organizations, how do you suggest finding funding and labor to meet these goals?
Well, I can, funding and labor, I mean, that's challenging for any initiative. I think the commitment part is not necessarily the expensive part, right? You could commit, you could sign anything, say we're going to be net zero. It's the implementation and the detailed analysis that goes into that. It's when you go for a robust net zero plan, this is where the cost can start coming into effect. I mentioned earlier that in embedding net zero planning into an overall strategy for an organization can be really important. And part of the reason it's important is identifying funding sources, staffing, and other resources that are available in order to see the plan through. So I think it's really important that the net zero plans align with how an organization operates, considers the resources that it has available, and then even prioritizes to look at how there could be cost savings. Energy efficiency is a great example. There's savings by using less energy. You're also there's less emissions associated with that as well. So kind of a win-win there. There's a lot of examples of that in transportation as well, with using alternative fuels or electric vehicles. Over time, it can pencil out to actually result in cost savings. So, really detailed analyses need to be done, but it's worth the effort, and it's the way to actually making good on these targets.
I just wanted, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. I just wanted to piggyback on to what you said about the cost savings. And it's really important, I think, to engage with a company and the CFO or whoever's developing the budget and the accounting people and operations. Because if you can plot out to them and show them the business case for reducing emissions by implementing some type of energy efficiency plan, that will table out in terms of dollars. And then you can put a dollar amount on that and say, this is where we can pay for a consultant or this other service or whatever to help develop this plan. And it's actually maybe even going to save money, or it will zero out the cost of doing that. I'd also like to put a plug in for our software platform for the Climate Registry. It is something that can be used for measuring, reporting, and third-party verification of carbon inventory, but it also can be used by a member to plan out different scenarios of what would happen if, say, they reduce their emissions in one of their facilities, and so they can use that to figure out, what if scenarios, and then be able to put a dollar amount on that in terms of what the emission reduction would mean for the organization. So that's a really good way to kind of plot out those scenarios, like Dan said, in a fairly cost-efficient way.
Great. Thanks, Amy. And actually, to add on to what you were saying, Amy, we got a question. Does the Climate Registry have publicly disclosed standards for reporting on GHG emissions? And if so, where can we learn more? So I'll pass that to Amy because I feel like she has an answer for that.
Yes, definitely we do. And I'd like to have Dan talk a little bit about the publicly disclosed the reports and how we handle that in terms of policy. Dan?
Yeah, sure. So TCR internally, well, we have, if I understood the question correctly, it was asking about our carbon footprint as an organization. Is that correct?
It's asking about if we have publicly disclosed standards for reporting. So our general reporting protocol.
Okay, yeah, yes, we do. So we have a general reporting protocol and verification protocol that's associated with the software platform that Amy mentioned, our carbon footprint registry. Those protocols were developed with stakeholder input. Our general reporting protocol is on its third version. It is aligned with GHG protocol. We borrow a lot of the best practices from GHG protocol, so familiar to a lot of companies out there, the scope 1, 2, and 3 format. But we also add on verification for the disclosure part of it. So we looked at for third-party verification from accredited verifiers to do that work. We screen it and make sure that it is aligning with our protocol and ISO standards, and that there is good credibility for the data that is going into evaluating that carbon footprint of that organization. So yeah, those are some of the standards that we use to make sure that the emissions that are reported through our system are credible.
Great. Just to add on to that, if you are looking for more information on TCR's reporting protocols and verification protocols, those are all available on our website, and the link to our website is on the slide there. So please check those out, or reach out to us if you have questions about reporting on your GHG emissions and developing inventories. That's kind of it's our bread and butter. It's what we exist to do, and we are really empowered to help organizations achieve that to the best of our ability. So at that, I'm going to wrap us up, but I'll toss it over to Dan to say some final remarks.
Yeah, just want to thank everyone for attending today. We love the interest in net zero and great questions at the end there. And we really look forward to continuing to get information out there about net zero and help our members and the public understand more about these commitments and work to be transparent and open and successful in their journey to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you all for attending today.
And thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.